Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. I'm Heather Parry and I'm thrilled that you could join me today for what I think is the perfect event for a rainy Sunday afternoon, all about crosswords and the people that love them, which I'm sure will include many of you. Today's event is presented in partnership with the New York Times, and I'm thrilled to have with me Adrienne Raphel and Joel Fagliano. How are you guys?
Hey, good. It's great to be here.
Hey, great to be here.
Adrienne is a widely published writer and the author of the warm and delightful book, Thinking Inside the Box, which you will be able to buy in the Edinburgh Festival bookshop. And Joel is the digital crossword editor for the New York Times and is also involved with their wildly popular print crossword as well. Today we're going to have a little bit of a chat, and then Joel is going to present us with some slides about how we can do our own digital crossword at home. And then we're going to have about 15 minutes of audience questions, which by the power of technology, I will have with me here. So do put your questions through on the chat, and we'll put it to Adrienne and Joel at the end. So I guess a good question to start with, guys, is what brought you into the wonderful world of crosswords? Joel, how about we start with you?
Sure. Well, I didn't grow up thinking I was going to have a career in crossword puzzles. It's definitely somewhat unexpected. I think like many of the rest of you, I just loved puzzles growing up. My dad would always photocopy the New York Times Crossword and give it to me on my way to school. And one day I was bored in class and I started doodling a little crossword in my notebook and kind of went from there, started submitting to the New York Times. And the first, however many, got rejected by Will Shortz with very nice notes. And eventually I had one accepted when I was in high school. And when I was in college, I ended up interning with him. And since then, it's been the only job I've ever had. So an unusual path for sure, but that's how I became a professional crossword editor.
And now you've got many people's dream job.
Yeah, for sure.
Adrienne, how about you?
That's funny. My dad also photocopied the puzzle when I was a kid. I've always been interested in words and playing with language and doing the crossword puzzle. But I guess for me, where I got really interested in the crossword was through culturally. I was thinking, this is a thing that everybody does. I do it, Joel does it, Heather, you probably do it. Everybody, so many people, millions and millions of people have this relationship with the crossword. And it's so involved in not just literature and language, but in history and art. It's just like it touches everything. And yet I hadn't really read or come across that much, really thinking about, what is this thing that is everywhere? It touches everything. And yet we don't really think that much about it. So that's where I came into it as a writer and thinker. I was like, oh, wow, this is something that I do all the time, but I haven't really thought about what does it mean in my life.
And a cultural context as well, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah.
I was really thrilled to read in the book that the history of the crossword actually comes to Liverpool in the north of England. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Adrienne?
Yeah, so the inventor of the crossword is originally a Liverpudlian, is that right? Is that the term?
Nailed it.
Yes. Yeah, Arthur Wynne, who is an editor at the New York World. He at that time, and then he was living in New York. He's from Liverpool, but then moved to the United States as a teenager, I think. So in 1913, he needed some puzzle to fill the pages of the New York World, the sort of bigger fun section at Christmas time. And so he had seen puzzles that were sort of word searchy and he had seen lots of kind of word game things, but nobody had done the thing of printing a blank grid with clues next to it that then you then looked at the clues, filled in the answers, and there was your crossword puzzle. So December 21st, 1913, that's when our dear Liverpudlian puts the crossword onto the map.
I kind of didn't think that it was so young in a way. I know it's, 100 years old in the kind of format that we know it now, but it seems like an archetype, like one of the things that's just existed forever, and I've never really thought about the history of it. I was also really interested to read about the kind of moral panic around it, and how the New York Times in particular was really holding out on including a crossword until a fairly significant event. Joel, do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In very New York Times fashion, they were the last to arrive to the crossword because they felt it was beneath them. That was for other frivolous papers. And you'll notice, actually, the New York Times still doesn't have a comics page for this very same reason. There's certain things the New York Times doesn't do. And in this case, it was the crossword. However, so in the 1940s, with the onset of the war, the newspaper became an incredibly bleak place, right? Every day you're opening up the newspaper to just really grim headlines and facts. And they realized readers needed something. They needed a break. They needed something that could bring them joy and want to get the newspaper every day. And that was when they actually ended up introducing the crossword.
And it seems like it really quickly got a lot more popular than they had perhaps anticipated.
Yeah, and so the very first editor of the New York Times Crossword was a woman named Margaret Farrer. And the crosswords had gone through a craze, which Adrienne writes about in her book. In the 1920s, there were people wearing, crossword print clothing, and it was actually like a big cultural fad. And not to say that it had died, but by the 1940s, crosswords were just a staple, but not a huge part of the culture. And the New York Times Crossword, the very first editor, Margaret Farrer, she sort of standardized crosswords. She introduced a bunch of rules about how to make them better, how to make them more interesting. And we still use all of those today, which is kind of fascinating. Things about crosswords having themes, the long answers being related in some way. That's a Margaret Farrer invention that goes all the way back to the 40s. So from the very beginning, the New York Times Crossword actually started to pioneer in the art or the field of crosswords. And we still do.
It was really interesting as well to read about the female sort of history of it, but yet how there is still quite a gender imbalance. And I loved, Adrienne, reading about the like female crossword ingenue pages. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, in the 1920s, Joel had mentioned there was this crossword craze, and one of the people who was really involved in the crossword craze was a woman named Ruth von Poole, who was the best crossword solver of the 1920s. And she would regularly at tournaments, she would set the standard time for the crossword. She was just amazing at these things, and she was like 20 years old. And the actually in some of like the very first editions of the New Yorker magazine have like a little talk of the town piece about Ruth von Poole, and that's where I came up with this crossword ingenue, because it's basically what they call her. They're like, it's so great that the crossword has such a pretty face attached to it. It's really like you wouldn't publish that. It's really weird to read today, but it's basically like, oh, the crossword has this pretty face attached to it, and also she's got a brain. She's the best crossword solver in the United States. But yeah, then Ruth von Poole, she eventually sort of got bored with the crossword, and she became one of the really foremost James Joyce scholar.
Yeah, I love the stuff in the book about writers as well, as like a literature nerd, finding out that Joyce was like a huge crossword person, but also that there was this overlap in culture as well. And I think you talk about Nabokov as well, being like a huge crossword fan.
Yeah, Nabokov wrote the first crosswords in the Russian language, and he used to make these like little crosswords to his wife when they were separated for a time. She was ill and getting some treatment, and he would sort of write her every day. And he started writing sort of like a newspaper. And when you write like a newspaper, if you're going to be a good newspaper, you have to include a crossword in it. So being Nabokov, then he starts like writing her these little crossword puzzles. And yeah, he's really excited about sort of the possibilities of the crossword as a way to kind of free his mind up and take a break, but also as a way to really play with language in different form than you can do when you're writing out just prose text.
I think as a kind of casual crossworder, let's say, what's the word you use in the book? Is it cruciverbalists? People who love crossword, that's
Yes.
my word of the week. I've been using it in every possible instance. As a casual cruciverbalist, I didn't realize how much of a culture was around not just people who solve them, but people who, I think we call them setters. What do you guys call them in the States?
We call them constructors.
Constructors.
In the States, yeah.
Joel, can you tell us a little bit about your kind of troupe of setters and how they interact with the New York Times?
Sure, yeah. So there's a common misconception that Will Shortz makes all the puzzles for the New York Times, and actually he's just the editor. So the people, when you're solving a puzzle, that's made by someone around the country, even around the world, who submitted a crossword to us. We get over 175 puzzles sent to us every week, or upwards of 500. I guess it's now over 600 a month, because people have been particularly busy during the time when they're quarantined, as you would imagine. Yeah, and so it's a really interesting group of people. They come from all backgrounds. There are a lot of musicians, and I've found a lot of mathematicians and computer scientists, because there's something very logical and structural about building a crossword. But of course, it's also some librarians and other people who just love language, who are attracted to it for that reason. And really anybody can get into it. There's free software to build crosswords, as I'll show you a little bit later in this talk. And you just need a good idea and then a lot of perseverance. And if you're building it on paper, an eraser, because there's a lot of trial and error. But what I love about it is it really, at the end, the best crosswords reflect their makers. They have little jokes that person finds funny or things they've been reading recently. And it's sort of a snapshot of a person at a time, which is a really neat thing.
And do your themes kind of change with cultural events or politics or things like that?
Yeah, we try not to dip into politics too much for obvious reasons. But yes, the themes, I mean, around Christmas time, there'll almost inevitably be some sort of theme around the holidays. But for the most part, the themes are actually slated by the day of the week. So if you're a regular Times crossword solver, you'll know that the Monday crossword is the easiest. Then it goes all the way up until the Saturday crossword is like the hardest crossword you've ever seen. And so the Monday theme is usually like, what are these last words all have in common? Oh, they're all parts of a bike or something like that. The Thursday crossword will be like, all of a sudden answers go backwards and also they're in Latin. You know what I'm saying? Things escalate quickly across the week. But we want the themes to, I'd compare it kind of to like a circus, right? You just want different things. Each day you don't know what to expect and you're kind of delighted to find, wow, what is this cool new wordplay discovery that they are serving me up today?
And how do you find your community? From what I was getting from what Adrian had written in the book, it sounds like yours is a strangely high-pressure job, because it seems like your readers aren't afraid to tell you if you do something wrong.
Well, particularly in the age of the internet, there are a lot of people who are very willing to say how they thought about the crossword that day. Their impressions, was it too hard? These two answers shouldn't have crossed, and so on. So the crossword solving community, it's the best community I've ever met. A lot of curious, open-minded, smart people who also all share, I would say, a little bit of a pedantic quality, right? To be into crosswords, you really know meanings and you know what means what and what doesn't. And so if we make the slightest slip up, whether it be a factual error or maybe a misdefinition, we hear from so many people, because people, they not only notice it, but they care. They care enough to say, 5 down today really shouldn't have used this synonym, and here's why. And I find that it keeps me ready. It keeps me alert, and that's good.
I definitely got more intelligent just from reading Adrienne's book, because I had to look up words every 5 minutes that I don't think I've ever used in my life.
Yeah.
And Adrienne, I was really fascinated about how that was actually used. So the fact that people who love doing crosswords are so dedicated and have such a particular mindset. This was actually used during World War II. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's one of my favorite stories, and it's actually one of the earliest things I found out when I started researching crosswords way back. There was a contest in the Telegraph, I believe, in England, where it was a contest, and on the face of it, they said, okay, we are running a crossword solving kind of tournament. If you think you're really good at crosswords, come into London and solve in this room, and may the best solver win. And what it actually was intelligence officials in Britain were looking for people to serve as code breakers for Enigma, and they needed more code breakers, and they thought, what's a great way to recruit civilians who are really, really, really talented at logic, puzzle-minded things? Oh, the best crossword solvers in the country. So basically the winners are the people who did the best on this tournament. A few days later, intelligence officers come and knock on their door and say, psych, that wasn't a crossword tournament. That was a recruitment test, and now you are cordially requested to serve your country and come to Bletchley Park and do code breaking for us. So basically, I think that crosswords kind of helped the Allies win the war,
It seems like it actually made them quite paranoid as well, because there's the part of the book where someone is suspected of being a spy by giving their answers that seem to be communicating something. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so then crosswords also are accused of being traitors. So it's so there's this setter named Leonard Daw who's a headmaster at a boys' school just outside London, and all of a sudden in crosswords that he was publishing, there were these weird words that kept appearing, like Utah and Mulberry, Overlord, Neptune, good words, interesting words. But when you have a bunch of them in close concentration with each other, these were all words that were secretly code words for Normandy operations, D-Day operations. So intelligence officers realized, wow, all of our code words are appearing in the crossword puzzle. That's bizarre. What is the crossword being used to actually be a double agent and transfer information? Turns out that there was an army base next door to the school where Leonard Daw, this constructor who had been setting all these crosswords, or I guess a setter if he's in Britain. So Leonard Daw's a setter. He's been doing these crosswords. Turns out there's an army base next to the school where he works. He had been recruiting his students to help him fill in the crossword grid, because Joel, you can speak to this. If you're making 1 million crosswords, you just need you need a little help to fill in your grids. And if you don't have Crossfire or nice word lists, you need your students to help you. And the students were kind of overhearing words from the army base because they like to go hang out and listen to the soldiers. They'd hear these cool words, like the soldiers talking about Mulberry, Overlord, Neptune. Those are fun words. They came back, put them in the grid. Leonard Daw is just okay, cool, I have a grid now. But so the crossword was kind of inadvertently this thing that was being used to transmit code words, and nobody had any idea. And when intelligence officers knocked on Leonard Daw's door and said, your crosswords are traitorous to the country, it's what? I'm a crossword setter. What are you talking about?
I love that you can accidentally become a spy or a traitor to your country. Do I? I'm actually quite panicked about it now. Joel, we're going to get to your slides in a second so that the people at home can get about setting their own crosswords. But I just wanted to ask you guys, a lot of people during lockdown have come back to puzzles. I've seen tons of people not only doing things like crosswords, but Sudoku and jigsaws have become a gigantic thing over here. What do you think is the enduring thing about crosswords that brings people back to it in difficult times? Adrian,
I'll go first with this. Well, I think it's two things. I mean, there's an enduring appeal of just filling in that last square in a crossword, no matter the size. I've found even with my minis, which are significantly smaller than the bigger crossword, people play them because feeling upon filling in a crossword, that rush of satisfaction and achievement, it's not one you can find in life very often. Will often says it's just this self-contained experience where you know you're going to get closure at the end of it. You know, a lot of things in life are left open-ended, and there's confusion. I mean, we certainly know that in this time. And crosswords, you start on them. Often they push you. Often you think maybe I have to give up. You get up, you walk back, you come. All of a sudden you have a breakthrough, and there's just this great sense of completion upon filling one. And the other thing I'd say, crosswords reflect culture and reflect life in a way that few other enduring puzzles do. So if you take something like Sudoku, which is a very great puzzle, it's just always going to be 1s through 9s filling into boxes, and it's fun, but it'll never teach you something about the world. It'll never reflect the way the culture is. I was thinking about this the other day because, you know, a year ago, Zoom, you would clue it as move very quickly. And now the first thing you think of when you think of Zoom, when you're going to clue it, is of course, obviously what we're all speaking on now. So I like that crosswords are a puzzle that reflect life and reflect culture.
Adrienne, would you agree with that?
That's so well put. And the thing that I would add to that is that crosswords are also surprisingly social and kind of the perfect thing to be social and distant at the same time. So I've found with crosswords, I found this before, but especially now, they facilitate conversation among family, friends, internet strangers, whomever. It's a place where, you know, it can be really, really anxiety provoking and stressful to look at any other thing happening in the news or outside your door. But the crossword is a thing that you can do and then talk about and enjoy talking about and get frustrated about, but also get excited about with other people. And so I think that that's something that is also got enduring appeal, where the crossword is a place to connect even while we're distant from each other.
I think that's a great answer as well. And I think that's the perfect time to flip over to you, Joel, so you can show us how to make our own.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Okay, so I'm going to walk you guys through how the mini crossword is made. So I'll say a bit briefly about the mini crossword, as it's the part I'm most in control of for the crossword. So what is the mini crossword? Each one is 5 squares by 5 squares. And for some context, the normal crossword you're used to doing from the New York Times is 15 squares by 15 squares. So this is quite a bit smaller. And it's meant to be done in a minute or two. The average solving time is 1 minute and 45 seconds, roundabout, depending on how hard I've made it that day. And it's aimed at beginners. So, you know, the New York Times Crossword has a reputation, a well-earned reputation, I'll say, of being the hardest puzzle in the country, like kind of like the Mount Everest of crosswords. Like if you can climb it, you can climb anything, which is great. And that suits some people. But I've always felt that it also locks a lot of other people out. There are a lot of people who could get a reward and a happiness from crosswords, but feel like they're not crossword people because they tried one once and it was too hard. So I pitch these puzzles at, you know, people my age, my friends, who are perfectly smart people who should be into crosswords, but for some reason think that it's not for them. And really anybody who is going through and reading the news can stop and have a little fun with the crossword. Obviously, reflecting my own personality, there's a little bit more current pop culture, some slang, but also because they live in a news feed and you're reading articles from the day, they reflect the news more than the normal crossword does. The normal crossword, because it's anthologized in books and stuff, tries not to have stuff very topical, but I might throw in, you know, Comey or something, some 5-letter word that's in the news and put that in the mini. And you can find it, I mean, we have an Android app and an iOS app on our website. It's found in the newsreader app, but it's also in the newspaper now. If you pick up the A section of the New York Times, turn a page, it's on A3, and it's even on the Snapchat story if that's what you're into. Since I got over 2 million people do it every day. Okay, so enough about that. Let's talk about how to make a mini crossword. So if you're at home and you want to take out like a piece of paper and a pencil, you can construct along here. So you can construct by hand, and I do sometimes, but most of the time I make crosswords with software. There's crossword making software, it's free. It's called Crossfire, and if you just Google it and look it up, it's free to download. So what are the different steps? So first we're gonna set the black squares. We're gonna place our black squares in the grid. We're gonna pick out what's called a seed entry, which is the first entry we wanna put in. It might be interesting because it's never appeared in a puzzle before. It might just be a word with J's and X's and it's just an interesting word, or one you've thought of a great clue for and you really wanna start the puzzle with that. We're gonna work off of that word and come up with a fill we're happy about. Then we're gonna write the clues. That comes last. A lot of people ask about that. The clue writing actually comes at the end because otherwise you're duplicating work. You know, if you're thinking of clues and you get to a dead end, you have to delete everything. You've just wasted 15 minutes on clues that won't appear in the puzzle. And then finally, a little bit of a fact check. Okay, so we'll start with a blank grid. So the first thing, you'll see it's 5 by 5 squares, and we need to place our black squares. So there are a couple of rules that New York Times Crosswords follow. They're actually different from British crosswords. So black squares cannot go in that second, third, or fourth row. Likewise, the sixth, where the columns that are labeled 6, 7, and 8, black squares couldn't go there either. And you might ask why. That would create 1- and 2-letter answers, which we don't allow. Words must be longer, 3 letters or longer in American crosswords. So if I was to put a black square where that 2 is, it would create a 1-letter word going across at 1 across, which wouldn't be allowed. So that actually quite limits where we can put the black squares. So let's say we decide to put one in that upper right, that purple square. You'll see that now one magically appeared in the lower left. So this is another rule of American crosswords. They have what's known as rotational symmetry. So if you pick up any crossword, go into the New York Times Crossword app, open up a puzzle and flip your phone upside down 180 degrees, you'll see that the grid looks exactly the same. This is another Margaret Farrer, to harken back to that. She introduced this rule. It's mostly for aesthetic reasons, but it's also so that if a 15-letter answer appears in one section of the grid, it'll appear in the corresponding section, and that's where you can put your theme material, your theme answers. So that's some rules about putting black squares. If you don't want to make them symmetrical, sometimes I don't. I don't think anybody really cares about this, but it is a rule that we follow here at the New York Times. Okay, so now let's come up with a seed entry. And the first kind of rule about crossword making is to lean on your vowel-heavy answers. So you might notice when you're doing a crossword that Oreo seems like the favorite cookie of everybody in the world. That's because it's full of vowels. It's a great cookie and all, but it's because it's full of vowels. ERA, E-R-A, that's the most common answer in New York Times crosswords. I think it appears in something like 1/6 of every puzzle, something crazy. That's because it's short, it's got common letters, and it's full of vowels. So we want something that's going to alternate vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. That'll give us all sorts of vowels to work with. And we also want something that's a little bit new, maybe hasn't appeared in crosswords very much. So for this, I chose emoji. I know it's very millennial of me, but that's what we're going to do today. We're going to start with emoji. And the next rule of crossword making is to find the most constrained area. So we could start at 1 down, blank E, blank, blank, but there are so many answers, so many possibilities that we could put there that we'll never know if we're going down a blind alley. So I would choose to start here. Once I've placed emoji, my eye just instantly gets drawn to 4 down because there are, I don't know, 15, 20 words in the English language, words and names that have a J in the second position. It's actually quite rare. We can already rule out, well, there are no words that start AJ. There are no words that start OJ, 5-letter words. There are no words that start IJ or UJ. Certainly not K, T. You know, we're already starting to really get down. And if we want a vowel in that spot, it basically has to be an E. And so if I start to think, okay, what's a 5-letter word starting with EJ? I can hear you shouting at home. Eject. Okay, great. So we've got emoji and we have eject. And you can already start to see there are areas of the grid that are starting to look a little constrained, like that lower right section. You know, going across at 8 across, we can already rule out some possibilities for that last letter. It can't be a D. No words end CD, CP, CF, CG, and so on. So, you know, as crossword makers, we lean on very common bigrams. So that's two sections of 2 letters. In this case, something like CK, right? There are a million words that end CK, and ER. So I might go with a word like irks. Okay, so we have emoji, eject, and irks. And you can see it's starting to shape up. We've got some alternating. At 7 across, we know we're going to probably want a consonant, then a vowel under the M, then another consonant, and so on. I'll give you another tip for making crosswords, which is S's are your friend. So put them at the bottom of the grid. In this case, my eye just gets drawn to that 8 and that 9. If you put S's there, now, for one thing, I can already see I'll have options at 9 across. It could be SATs. It could be SITs, SOTs. At 8 across, you know, slacks, stack, and so on. So there's going to be lots of possibilities. And we'll know going down, there will be some plural answers. S's are helpful because you can just always be assured there will be lots of options. So I'm going to put a T and an S there, and then another S. So you might ask why did I put that T there? I still have flexibility. I can do emits, or I can do omits, but I know that I'll have some possibilities to put vowels where I want and leave the consonants out of the trouble areas. So we're very close now. If you're following along at home, you probably have some suggestions like 8 across. I mean, there's going to be a lot of possibilities. Stack, stick, stock, stuck. You know, we can do all sorts of things there. But probably on the bottom, we want an E. You know, if we were to do something like stock and sits, we would have blank OI going down at 3 down, and that's going to be bad news. So if we put an so we can do omits in there, and if we put an I and an E, we've got 4 letters left. Already my mind is going through possibilities for 3 down, like David Bowie. It'd be great to give him a shout out, right? But you always have to check, what does that put in the crossing area? Now all of a sudden at 7 across, we have blank I W. No, that's not going to work. So we're going to need something that's going to go at 7 across and give us possibilities, at 1 across, and at 3 down. I like to go with common words that will have lots of interesting cluing possibilities. So for 3 down, what leaps to my mind is movie. Movie, right? There's going to be all sorts of fun ways to clue that. Okay, so we're down to 2. Here's where it just becomes, it's not about personal preference anymore. It's like kind of like what works. And, you know, at 7 across, my mind's already going through, we could do giver, diver, liver would be good. But if we did something like liver, you know, 1 down would be blank ELS. And you could do gels, but then I have gome. So no, that's not going to work. Right, so this is how we're doing it. So why don't we think about what could work at 1 across? Again, a word that's flexible, that has lots of meanings. So how about something like home? Okay, 1 letter left. And, you know, something like diver, that'd be a great, interesting word at 7 across, but HEDS, that's not a word. Giver, but HEGS, that's not a word. So I wonder if anyone at home is probably spamming the chat right now with the correct answer. There's only 1 letter that works in both directions, and that is hers and river. Hers and river. And you know what I'm noticing now, which is actually interesting, is 3 down could also have been moxie, you know, like gumption. And that could have been mixer, because I was thinking, oh, I would like hems there at 1 down. So hems, mixer, and moxie is what we call an alternate fill. You know, maybe I'm going through the cluing and I'm not liking it so much. I might go back and say, okay, well, what if I did this instead? And make little edits that way to the grid. And you'll notice I really haven't committed to any clues yet. I'm just making sure, okay, home, emoji, river, stick, sets, hers, omits, movie, eject, irks. That's what we call a clean construction. We're not leaning on any weird, obscure words or names people don't know. Okay, and now we would move on to the cluing. So some basic rules about cluing for crosswords. Clues and answers have to share the same part of speech. So what do I mean by that? Let's take an answer like river. River's a noun. It needs to have a noun clue. So you couldn't clue river as flows fastly, flows through a stream bed or something like that, right? That'd be a verb phrase, and we couldn't use that to clue a noun. So for river, we're going to have to do something like the Amazon, e.g. That's the Amazon, for example. And that lets the solver know I'm looking for a noun similar to the Amazon. This is the next one, diversity of references. This isn't quite, I would say, like a hard and fast rule, but it's a good way to make your puzzles have the widest appeal. Let's look at this puzzle. Okay, so home and sets. Now I'm a sports fan myself, so my initial inclination might be to clue sets as parts of a tennis match and home as one of the bases in baseball. But just because I'm a sports fan doesn't mean all solvers are. And it's not fair to overload your puzzles with one specific area of knowledge. If you're a really big music buff, putting in a bunch of songs and artists has a tendency to turn off people who aren't into that particular topic. So it's nice to have a puzzle that touches on all parts of life, that touches TV, movies, Greek mythology, current events, and just kind of stimulates the solver's knowledge of all things. And then finally, I've kind of made up this last one. I call it the 7-2-1 rule. And it's basically my way of knowing I've pitched the difficulty of the puzzle the correct way. So I try to have 7 dead easy clues for the mini. Maybe not dead easy, but ones that I expect most solvers will look at the clue and have a sense of how to answer. 2 clues that are just a little bit on the tougher side, and 1 clue that's downright tricky. So let's go through. So here are my 7 easy ones. For home, I did the H of HBO, and I often like to throw a really easy clue at 1 across, just to kick people off into the puzzle, not to kind of like, they log in, do the puzzle, and instantly you're pushing them away and saying, no, I'm throwing you a really hard one. I like to just draw people in with a nice easy clue, give them some letters. Unit of butter for stick. I did go with sections of tennis matches. After all, I couldn't resist. Gender-specific possessive for hers. Leaves out, omits, pop out as a DVD. Annoys. So nothing too colorful there, I would say, but everything's right on target and easy. So I'm left with movie, river, and emoji. And my mind starts to run like, how can I make more difficult clues for these? And with this, you like to start to think, what are some words related to these concepts that have separate meanings? So something like movie, well, set is a good example of a word that has a lot of different meanings and also relates to movies. But here's another rule about American crosswords. You can't have a word in a clue that is also found in the grid. So in this case, sets is in the grid, and I couldn't use it as my clue or part of my clue for movie. What's also interesting is we could do what's called a cross-reference here. So movie sets is a phrase. We could say, at 3 down, we could say, with 9 across, filming locales. And those are movie sets. And 9 across would say, see 3 down. And I'm just actually noticing now, home also crosses movie. We could do home movie too. That's actually kind of elegant. Home, movie, and movie sets. Makes me want to use this for the paper. Okay, so this is a cool interlock where we could do some cross-referencing. But let's say I wanted to do a reference clue here. So I'd like to, when I would pick 2 movies to reference here, I'd like them to be related in some way. 2 numbers in the title, like 21 Jump Street and 12 Years a Slave would be nice because they both have numbers at the start. Or what I went with in the end was Philadelphia or Chicago, 2 US cities, both movie titles. It adds a little bit of an elegance to it and has the solver thinking like, oh, what do Philadelphia and Chicago have in common? Oh, they're in quotes. That means they're titles. There's a nice chain of thoughts that leads to the answer there. And for river, I did the same thought exercise. I thought, okay, what are some terms related to river that also mean other things? Well, there's a river mouth. And I came up with a riddle. What has a mouth but never speaks? So a cute little riddle. It's not that hard, but it also gives the solver a little bit of pushback, something to think about. So finally, we're left with emoji, and I just want to end on talking about, if you've done some New York Times crosswords, you'll see clues with question marks. And that's like a blinking red light that means, pun incoming, usually a groaner. And it means this is going to be a jokey clue that's going to try to mislead you a little bit. So I tried to come up with one of those for emoji. So I'll do the same exercise, What are some things I can think of related to emoji? Well, it's a symbol. So I could do like symbol of modern culture, something like that. Emojis have faces, right? So I ended up going with, it's the face of modern technology. And you might read that and think, okay, who's the face of modern technology? Like Mark Zuckerberg or something, I don't know. But no, the answer leads you instead to emoji. It's a face in modern technology. Maybe not my best joke of all time, but a joke nonetheless. And now we have our final mini crossword. So you'll see we've got a nice clean grid. We've got an array of references. The puzzle shouldn't be too hard. And you should be able to kind of try to make your own puzzles after this too. That's all there really is to it. Now remember, you want to focus on a seed phrase that's giving you lots of vowels, vowel and consonant alternation, making sure you don't back yourself into a corner by focusing on the most constrained area first. And finally, imbuing your clues with some fun and some ways to make the solver smile. So it looks like we've got about 15 minutes left, and we can open it back up to some questions. I hope people enjoyed that little tour of how to make a crossword.
That was awesome, Joel. You've kind of blown my mind, and what I'm taking away from this is that I just don't know enough words.
The internet is very helpful too. I'll say there are some good websites for looking up patterns.
I don't think I would ever have gotten to emoji from that clue. I think I would have been stuck on Zuckerberg's face in my head for the rest of the time. Okay, so we have actually, through the power of technology, got some questions. And I'm going to start with one, Joel, that actually follows up really well on your chat. Doug B says, what is the key to making the different day puzzles in the New York Times of differing difficulty, e.g. Monday versus Thursday? Is it just the way that the clue is worded?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the Monday clues are about as easy as we can make them. A Monday clue, let's say you plucked a random person off the street. You would expect that 80% of those people should be able to answer a Monday clue. By the time you get to a Saturday clue, that number is probably down to 5%, 10%. It's really going to take having some letters in place and having a very flexible mind on a Saturday. We also make the puzzles more and less difficult based on their themes, as I said before. So a Monday theme is quite straightforward, and a Thursday theme, that's the hardest theme day. A Thursday theme is quite tricky. Then Friday and Saturday are what are known as themeless puzzles. So they're just extremely wide open. It's a huge interlock of 7 and 8 and 9 letter words, which is just naturally harder, right? Because those words are usually less common. And you also have less toeholds to go off of, less short words that appear all the time. And we make the clues more and less difficult, kind of as how you saw. We'll use more misleading words with multiple meanings, but also we might just throw in more hard trivia on the later week. It won't just be, President before Trump for Obama. It might be, something about one of his campaign slogans or something a little bit more esoteric, but still gettable.
That's so fascinating. Thank you. We've got a question that I think would go to both of you, but I'm going to put it to Adrian first. How would you describe the main demographic who regularly participate in and follow crosswords?
And Joel, I'll let you take this in a second if you have more numbers on this. I would say that, and when I was researching it, it's sort of beautifully all over the map. Like you kind of get people participating from everywhere, from all backgrounds. And I think that one thing that The New York Times Crossword has done really well, especially under Will Shortz and under you guys in the past, few decades, is really opening up the kinds of people who are interested in crosswords in the 60s, 70s, 80s. The clues and answers were much more skewed to cultural references that only sort of targeted a much more narrow bandwidth of the culture. And so that meant that you only had solvers from, I'd say the demographics skewed much more sort of white male, upper middle class, older, like that, or that was where the clues and answers are skewing. In the past few decades, though, that's just been blown wide open in this great way. And so the crossword is really reflecting what's going on in all of society. So that's something that was one of the most exciting finds to me in doing this research, was like just how diverse the world of crossworders is. But Joel, I don't know if you have sort of actual statistics on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, so anecdotally, right? Like, I think crosswords are associated with older people, and I know I have plenty of friends who go, my grandmother loves you. She's, I got a big grandma fan club, but I think crosswords have actually evolved a much bigger audience. For one thing, more recently, obviously, you can do crosswords on your phone now. In the past, you had to have like a New York Times home delivery subscription, right, or something, or be able to buy the books. So the crossword solving community has broadened, I believe, because, as Adrian says, the people who are making the crosswords are much more diverse than they used to be. And it's a big, actually, discussion in the crossword world. It's something we talk about all the time at the Times. I'll say, so that part of that question was about who makes the crossword, what's the demographics of those people. And in the past, they've skewed mostly male. So over most of the tenure of Will Shortz, we published 80% men and 20% women, sometimes less, which reflects the crosswords that we were actually getting sent to us. So there's an odd divide where in the crossword solving world, it's pretty split by gender. Actually, more women solve than men by our statistics. But then in the crossword making world, it's skewed very male. So that's something we've been really focused on addressing. Actually, this past year, the year of 2020, we've published, I believe it's 28% puzzles by women this year, which is the highest of the Will Shortz tenure. And of course, we want to go upwards from there. But it's just been a big discussion in the crossword world. How can we diversify who's getting into crossword making? And yeah.
That's really cool to hear. We've got to kind of follow up on that from David B. Have more people outside the US joined the New York Times wordplay since lockdown started happening? The spelling bee has become part of the routine, replacing my walk to work. That's nice. That's
really nice to hear. Yeah, so I don't have exact numbers on this, but games like Spelling Bee have an international following. One complaint, actually, Mark Thompson, the CEO of the New York Times, who's from England, once complained to me that crosswords aren't for him because they reference so much American culture. There's so much about like The Office or whatever, or like shows that only Americans watched. And a game like Spelling Bee, and we now offer several other games besides the crossword, other word games. Anyone can do them, and it just takes a knowledge of language. So I believe those games have had really wide appeal.
We've also got another question. Does the Times make an effort to ensure the puzzle clues are relevant to solvers outside of the US?
I would say it's something we should work on. I think we still do a lot of US-centric thinking because the majority of our audience is US-centric. We've even had to check ourselves on New York-centric clues of reference, like referring to specific streets in New York, like all of our solvers live there. I mean, we are the New York Times, but I think there's a growing awareness that this is a puzzle for the whole world. And you'll see a fair amount of Britishisms in the puzzle, but not as much, let's say, even like Australian lingo and stuff. I think that hasn't seeped into the puzzles yet because we don't have very many puzzles makers from there. But I think it'd be something that would be cool to include more of.
Nice. And we've got one that I think will be really good for you, Adrian, given how much you've dived into like this culture for this book. Tamar D says, can the speaker say something about the relationship between Scrabble and crossword solving?
So Scrabble was an offshoot, developed like as an offshoot of the crossword. It originated in the 30s, I think, and it like originally, yeah, it was sort of like a stepchild to the crossword. And I know that the Scrabble tournament culture and the crossword tournament culture have fewer overlaps among their regular members than one might think, kind of jumping into it, because you think, oh, word lovers, language lovers, playing with words and letters, that's going to be the same crowd. And I was surprised that I talked to a few people who are Scrabblers and cruciverbalists, and they told me that there was less overlap than you might expect. I think Scrabble is much more, really contained. Like, you don't have the kind of thinking about culture and history and politics, and you don't have kind of the world seeping into a Scrabble game. What's beautiful about Scrabble in some ways is that you can just really focus on letter by letter. But I think that actually makes it less of an overlap in terms of the people who are really invested in this game than people who are really crossword people who are interested in both how do you get the letters to sort through a grid, but also how do you clue them? How do you incorporate those kind of layers of trivia and wordplay? And so, yeah, there's a lot of overlap with the crossword community with other kinds of game communities. There's a sort of online trivia game called Learned League that a lot of crossworders participate in. That's a lot of like trivia but also like wordplay and fun facts. There's other sorts, a lot of crossworders. One of the top crossworders in the business, Eric Agard, was like a Jeopardy champion. Ken Jennings really likes crosswords. So there's more, there's anecdotally, I've seen more overlap between crossworders and other games than crossword and Scrabble, even though sort of paradoxically on the face of it, they are related games and seem like cousins.
I guess there's an element of competition with Scrabble. You have to play against someone, whereas with a crossword, you are challenging yourself in a way.
And there are crossword tournaments, which have also thrived during the pandemic in a cool way online. But you're right that the crossword is, even in these tournaments where you're playing against other people, it is ultimately you against yourself, against the clock, whereas Scrabble tournaments, it's very much, or Scrabble games, it's you against that other person.
Does that tally with what you see as well, Joel?
Yeah, I was just going to hop in to say, because I don't know if anyone on who's attending this has played Bananagrams, which is a very similar thing to Scrabble, but just more free form. And I spent last week at the beach with my fiance's family, and they wouldn't let me play because it was just a crossword making game. They were like, no, you do this all day. And it's true. There are definitely some traits that carry over. If you make crosswords, you're pretty good at putting words in a grid, and sometimes you're good at anagramming things in your head, but they're not quite the same.
We've actually got a really interesting question from Gareth R, and I'm going to put it to you first, Joel. Why do you think cryptic crosswords haven't really caught on in the US?
Yeah, so it's part of it is I think they've just not served in any of the daily newspapers, right? Like, we run cryptics in the New York Times once every 2 months in the Sunday magazine. And the reason we don't run as many is because they're much more difficult than American crosswords. And I've just gone through this whole spiel talking about how difficult New York Times crosswords are. Cryptics are actually even harder for those of you who haven't done them, although I suspect actually a lot of you have. Cryptic clues, each one is its own riddle that you have to crack before you can put the answer in the grid. It's not just a straight synonym or just a fact. It's actually like wordplay within every single clue of the puzzle. So I think part of it is Americans aren't used to them. And then speaking for myself, when I do try them, I'm like, ooh, these are hard. You know, they take a lot more thinking. That said, I know, speaking to Will Shorts, they're his favorite type of puzzle. And we've gotten a lot of requests to think about expanding our own cryptic offerings. So that's something we might try to do.
Do you think that's accurate, Adrian?
Yeah, I know that I also, you know, I see a cryptic and I see the answers, and I'm really pleased if I can, you know, put the two together. But I think the cryptic crosswords in America, I feel like they have a reputation of like they're the puzzler's puzzle. You know, like if you are really into American style crosswords, that's going to be your next step, your next thing. I love them because they have that layered function, and it's something that I would also aspire to be more proficient at.
I can't do them at all. Like the first clue, and I'm just like, I'm not clever enough for this.
They're hard.
I could chat to you both all day about this, but unfortunately we're running out of time. I would highly recommend that everyone go onto the bookshop, the Festival Bookshop, and buy Adrian's book. It's a really lovely, warm read, especially for times like these. And also, if you have enjoyed this event as much as I have, do feel free to go under here and click the donate button and help to support the festival, because it's free this year and we want to continue doing things in a way that includes so many people. Adrian, thank you so much. Joel, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. Enjoy your crosswords.